Well, obviously, we had the takedown of the Robert E. Lee monument yesterday, which is why we delayed our webcast, because we were going to be competing against old General Lee. And that was obviously a huge moment in Louisiana history, a very controversial decision that the mayor and the majority of the city council decided to do. I think ultimately it's a good thing, but these people, up until the very end, the opponents of removal, they were holding out their last hopes, going to Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser, petitioning President Trump, asking the Secretary of the Interior to intervene. Ultimately, obviously, it didn't work.
No, it didn't work. By the way, just from a technical standpoint, could you tell me whether or not it is posted on your Facebook page?
It is posted on my Facebook page.
Okay.
But I can promote it again.
Okay, no, I just wanted to. I didn't see. Okay, so yeah, for those. Okay, so for those people who are checking in from Twitter and Periscope and LinkedIn and YouTube, why don't you tell what happened with the situation with the Confederate statues? Why don't you give a little background about that?
Well, I guess begin at the beginning, right? So
Sure.
A lot of people think that these monuments were built immediately after the Civil War. They were not. They were built quite a couple of decades after. In one case, nearly 50 years after, to celebrate what's called the Lost Cause, which is a movement of former Confederate soldiers and their spouses and their children who attempted to basically revise history a little bit and glorify these leaders as Southern gentlemen, as genteel, as people who were sort of proud in their defeat. And really what this was about sending the signal to other folks, particularly African American folks, that regardless of what they thought during Reconstruction, the white establishment was still in charge. And in New Orleans, the three main Confederate monuments were, and there still are some other ones, right? But the three main ones were the PGT Beauregard Monument, who actually is a Louisianian, and that was in City Park. The Jefferson Davis Monument, which was on Jefferson Davis Boulevard. And then, of course, Robert E. Lee, which was, I think was 1888 was when it was constructed. It's worth noting that their connection to the state of Louisiana, with the exception of Beauregard, their connection to the state of Louisiana was very minimal. I mean, Jefferson Davis had some in-laws here. Robert E. Lee barely set foot in the state. There are other people that you would think would have been more appropriate people to glorify or to celebrate other than these folks. But regardless, during the last 50 or so years, after the civil rights movement in particular, there's been a lot of scholarship on what the real causes of the Civil War were. And we've had to reevaluate our assumptions about who these men actually were in the first place. Were they really opposed to slavery, as some of their defenders say? Were they really good people? And the evidence increasingly suggests that no, they were not good people, and they're not worth venerating, particularly in a city of 60% African Americans. So I thought that the city made a really good decision in taking that down. It's long overdue. They've tried twice, at least twice before, once in 1981 under Dutch Morial. They tried again in 1993 under Sid Bartholomew. But it took until 2017 for these things to finally go down. And it really was a 2.5 year long process with multiple meetings. I think Mitch Landrieu said 13 different court hearings. The people that were suing to keep the monuments, ironically, claimed their 14th Amendment rights were violated, which I think any student of history could appreciate the irony there.
Sure.
And they got essentially laughed out of court. So, there's a group of organizers in New Orleans, take them down, NOLA, and they have targeted other, I guess, organizations, 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 other landmarks, other streets, other monuments. But I think these four were the main ones. And the fourth one, by the way, which I didn't mention, was the Liberty Place monument. And that's, to me, perhaps one of the, maybe the most significant one. Obviously, Lee's the most prominent one, but significant in the sense that it wasn't about honoring a general or a war hero. It was literally about commemorating white supremacy. It was about honoring a group of people who murdered police officers after the police force became integrated. So that was removed. And the reason that's important to me is because when you poll on this, you ask people, are you in favor or do you oppose removing monuments to fallen Confederate soldiers? They never include this in their polling, that there was another monument that was removed, and it was explicitly about white supremacy. And I can imagine that if you were to poll the people of the state of Louisiana, that you would get nearly, a plurality of people that would say, yeah, keep that thing. So
it really was it has been a really emotional battle, pitched battle at that.
Yeah.
I mean, it brought up the whole issue of the purpose of the Civil War, like you said, the Confederacy. We had Confederate flags flying around. We had the new Black Panthers. It was really kind of frightening. Can you think of anything good that came out of it?
Yeah, I could think of a few things that were good that came out of it. I think that, first of all, I think it organized the people that were protesting in opposition to the removal of these monuments. We know for the most part that they were out-of-town folks. Actually, a lot of them from Southern California, a lot of them from Alabama and Mississippi and Oklahoma that drove in. These are white nationalists, David Duke followers. And by the way, David Duke had a big following in Southern California. Not a lot of people realize that. The organizers in support of removal, though, for the most part, were native New Orleanians or Louisianians with a connection to the city. So I think that's a good thing that came out of it, is that it really galvanized that community, this burgeoning progressive community of white and black folks, and it gave them a good cause to rally behind. I will say this, I recently filed a public records request with Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser's office and received about 425 emails back. I requested all of the emails that he received regarding the Confederate monuments, or whatever you want to call them, white supremacist monuments, Confederate monuments. And I was surprised because, and I'll write a story about this later, but I was surprised. I'd expected that most of those emails would be from out-of-towners or from what I like to call, when other people have called LARPers, live-action role players, people that dress up and pretend that they're fighting the Civil War and have this real weird fetish for Civil War. But there were a few of those. But for the most part, the letters, and they were universally in opposition to removal, were from prominent or well-known professionals in New Orleans, which surprised me to a certain extent. You have lawyers and doctors and real estate agents and money managers, and these aren't the people that we saw in the news during the protest, right? We saw people who were dressed in neo-Nazi uniforms, waving the Confederate flag. But the truth is that the real opposition, the real money behind the opposition, had nothing to do with those people that were out protesting in the street. The real opposition to this were these professional white folks that live in, let's say, the Uptown or Garden District in New Orleans, who are very conservative and who perhaps feel like this is a symbolic of their city, their lack of control in their own city. I think it's a fascinating story, and one that's not told,
So, I got to tell you, I personally was, I don't want to say ambivalent, but I will say that I was bothered by all this in many respects. Number one, I certainly respect the idea that those people who were impacted the most, who are African Americans, it's hard for me to put myself into their mind, their experience, and so I respect their concerns and their emotions about that. But likewise, I also respect, in my opinion, history. And so my thought was that they really, what the solution to this would have been to have put up QR codes so that, you know, people going by the monuments, they can go and take and capture the code and get a really great history lesson on their device and learn. You know, I really feel like we lost a really great opportunity to educate, and so that was, you know, ultimately my position on it was we shouldn't destroy any history at all. We should use the history to educate. And I was by no means, you know, the idea of the Confederate flags, no matter how it makes other people feel, to me, it's repugnant.
Well,
so that's my take.
Well, I understand, and I think it's a reasonable thing to suggest. The problem I have is that even if you were to do that, these monuments are still outside and still in the public square, and I'm not sure how you properly contextualize something like that with QR codes. To me, honestly, they belong in a museum. A city has the right to decide what to decorate its public spaces with, and the idea that this 300-year-old city, that these statues, which represent 4 years of a failed war, that they are in any way indicative of the history of this city, I think is just it's a lie. And I really think that I think merit, you know, although they haven't figured out what museum it's going to go to, and I understand that some colleges and universities that have been approached have already said we don't want them, but it's where they belong, some place like the Smithsonian, or maybe a newly formed museum in Louisiana that's specifically about the Civil War. We don't actually have one of those, and that would be a great learning experience and destination for school children. I just don't know how you make, and I've heard other people make the same suggestion you did, Stephen. I'm just not sure how logistically it works when you have two very different opposing sides in views of what the history there actually was. I mean, the people that are defending Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis really believe that the Civil War was not fought over slavery. They are convinced it was fought over states' rights, which of course makes no sense because these states formed their own confederacy, which was a union. They weren't clearly, if you look at the Articles of Secession, it was about slavery. And if you have such a fundamental gap in understanding between those two sides, I could just see miniature fights about, you know, how exactly to contextualize these monuments in the public square, and it would drag on for a long time.